Please welcome Amir Marandi, co-founder and chief executive officer, Zaver. Elizabeth Rossiello, chief executive officer and founder, AZAFinance. David Sneddon, vice president, Google. And Bloomberg's Morwenna, Coniam.
Good afternoon, and welcome to what I hope will be a thought-provoking discussion on building a thriving knowledge economy. And I'm aware we're nearing the end of our programme, so I do hope it will be lively. So we'll be looking at what makes a country attractive for companies to invest in. And not that just that, but to build and stay and contribute to economic growth. We'll be looking at how Europe can attract and retain talent, expertise, and ambition. 2023, it's already seen a slew of European companies choose to abandon their domestic listings in favour of US markets. And we've got more that are expected to follow. Meanwhile, Europe is lagging the US in terms of deep technology companies. And that poses a challenge as economic growth is increasingly pinned to digitization. Of course, the fallout and the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank has also dealt a further blow to startups as funding dries up and banks de-risk. So what do future solutions look like? And is regulation, talent, governance, tax, or other incentives the answer? Well, with us, we have three corporate leaders who are tackling some of these issues. We have David Sneddon, the Vice President of Google, and he leads the GTech professional services team across the EMEA region. He represents about 21,000 Google employees across the region, and he's one of the company's Irish site leads. And we have Elizabeth Rossiello. She's the CEO and founder of AZAFinance, which is an established provider of international payment solutions across more than 115 countries. And Amir Marandi, the co-founder and CEO of Zaver, a Swedish-based growing European fintech which provides size-agnostic real-time payments processing. Before I turn to our panelists, we do have a polling question. And that is, we want you to answer, what is the most important consideration in locating or relocating a business? And I think you can scan the QR code if you haven't already, and we would love to know what you think is the most important thing. So it looks, access to talent is in the lead, which is actually very interesting, as that is something we're hearing across the board in all industries that I've been talking to. I cover Ireland at Bloomberg, and it constantly comes up that talent is a challenge at the moment, especially in Ireland, where we have almost full employment. And that was the first topic that I was going to turn to for our panelists. Unemployment in the European economic area is broadly declining. And one of the things that we frequently hear, as I said, is companies are struggling to attract talent. And even as we're seeing some headline layoffs from large technology companies, of course. So I'm interested in what employers can do, and also what governments can do to help build and sustain the required expertise for European companies to grow and for companies to grow in Europe. So Amir, I'm going to start with you. As an entrepreneur building a company in Europe, what are the challenges when it comes to recruiting and retaining talent? And what do you need to see to overcome them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think the battle of talent is, first of all, it's an international battle. So we're competing with Asia, we're competing with China, we're competing with the US. And I think these topics are way, way larger than just flexibility or the perks that you can offer one another. Because as a tech company, if you look at the business world has solved this, if you're a lead generator, you will receive a kickback for every lead you basically generate. But for us as a tech company to bring in talent, intelligent people outside the EU to Sweden, it's a big hassle. It costs us a lot of money. It's a lot of administrative work, and you sometimes just don't do that. So I would say, if we want to have the smartest MIT engineers joining the Swedish ecosystem, we really need to create the incentives for them, right? You cannot tell this engineer to come to this country and promise them that they will be taxed 60% on their stock option programs. So you have to build the incentives in order to attract talent. You have to make it easier to bring intelligent people outside the EU to the EU, because these people will contribute to the further development of these societies. So I would say, I hope our regulators and the governments start to realize it's not a domestic battle between us and another Swedish payments company. It's between us and the rest of the world, and we need to create incentives needed in order to make these people want to come to these regions.
And Elizabeth, what's your experience been, and what do you see as the potential for improvement in making people want to come to this region, but also in helping people move across the region? Because I know that you work in different countries.
Right, so we have 5 offices globally, main offices, and another 3 satellite offices. And for us, it's very important to have local teams. So we operate in East, Central, West Africa. We bought a company in South Africa, so brought on 50 people there. But up above the equator, we have offices in Madrid and London. It's almost impossible for us to bring our talent up to the UK. We have 2 licenses to sponsor permits each year, so the maximum we can bring on of non-British talent is 2 a year. And to hire British engineers, it's very difficult to make them come into the office. Post-COVID, even pre-COVID, nobody wants to live in London. It's so expensive for young engineers. So we had to make an exception to our policy, even pre-COVID, that they could be remote. So some of them are in Scotland or maybe other parts of Europe. I think it's hard to have a traditional workforce if you're not paying, no offense, Google salaries or more. So that's a struggle. And what we've seen actually is that we have so much more talent developing in our African offices. 10 years ago, it was very hard to hire a senior engineer, a security, InfoSec professional. Now we see that market really exploding. And, for us, it's important to have cycling of employees through the offices. So we have a lot of employees spend 2 years at different offices and move between to create a really important overall culture. And that free movement is a lot easier between our African offices and even Madrid than it is to the UK. So that's a struggle for us.
And that's very interesting. And I think it's a potential for improvement there in making those transitions easier.
I mean, certainly. We've been bringing up two more each year from the UK. The UK has, even post-Brexit, despite inflation, despite housing costs, it does have a cachet with a lot of our team members. They want to live in a big metropolis. The schooling is great. So I think for the employees, there is still some pull for that. But definitely for our employees under 30, they want lifestyle. They want to live, in a place where they have, space, they're near the sun. They want to move from Madrid to Valencia. There's a big internal poll trying to persuade me to open up a Valencia office. So I think, when I was in my 20s, I was working in Canary Wharf. I don't think I ever breathed fresh air or saw the sun, and I was content with that. It's a completely different world that we're living in, especially post-COVID, and even pre-COVID, it was difficult. So I think employers need to just adapt their expectations of their workforce. And I was just talking to you before that I was recently bullied into making birthdays a holiday. And I was like, what is this request? But it had 85% approval from my team. And I definitely said no to the 4-day work week, but I gave it on the birthdays. And I think we just have to learn to be adaptive to attract the best talent these days.
At least it's only once a year. David, you're of course in a slightly different situation. At a large multinational, and actually in the process of trying to reduce headcount in Europe. I think it's about 240 jobs just in Dublin that are expected to go. How does the ability to attract talent differ in Europe from in other countries, but also the ability to adapt to business needs that you're now experiencing? You have to be able to be flexible. How is that challenge met in Europe, and where do you see opportunities?
we see lots of opportunities. I suppose maybe just to build on what my other two panelists have actually said, I think I'd sort of see the war for talent in two ways. First of all, there's location, lifestyle, and a sort of a hyper choice, largely as a result of the pandemic. We also have a very vigorous internal Google talent market too, and actually, just to answer your question now, actually, sort of both those things come together to a certain extent as we're thinking about this. We use Dublin as our European headquarters. We have about 6,000 people here, and largely working with customers in the advertising and cloud space. And we use that as a kind of a scaling and aggregation point. That's quite helpful, particularly to bring in, say, younger talent. And then we have offices in most European countries, or multiple offices in the larger countries, to which that talent often then moves. So back to that external bringing people in, but also internally providing them with sort of jump-off points. Amir's point is a well-made one. If there are any barriers to immigration or migration around the world, that of course affects companies that almost depend on the sort of slick movement of people around the world. But I would have it as a flag. But what I would say is that we think it's a manageable one. We think Dublin offers a scale. We think there is mobility. It's got to become easier. And my ask for the Irish government in particular would make it easier for people from places like India to come here, because the visa restrictions are quite severe. But I would echo what you're saying about the UK and other countries too. So that would be sort of how we broadly think about it. So it's still a pretty fluid market, but we do need to make sure that it doesn't become less fluid. Because then, to your opening point, then we still think Europe is super attractive, but we wouldn't want barriers to go up to make mobility, say, in and out of the European Union harder. I think that would be a disadvantage.
And speaking of barriers, of course, as you are letting people go, that is a more difficult process in Europe than it is, say, in the US. And that's just one of many regulations that perhaps is different for companies operating in this region, particularly in terms of employment, but then any other regulations. How is that a constraint, and will that put companies off, do you think, hiring rapidly because they can't then reduce their headcount at the same speed?
We don't really see that. I mean, yes, European workers enjoy a different set of rights to what the American worker enjoys, and there are certain cultural elements a part of that too. But no, I don't see it as a disinhibitor. Big multinationals do business in every single country, and we are really proud of our locations in all of those countries, as well as obviously our American headquarters. On the regulation side, we welcome regulation. It's something, we welcome anything that allows companies to trade successfully in whatever their environment is. We would always try and work very closely with regulators to make sure that it's not a disincentive to doing business, and that's why we would try and partner with as many governments and regulators as possible. But again, I wouldn't raise any of that as a flag. I just think a sort of consistency and stability of environment is probably the most helpful thing, particularly when you're dealing with people in California who maybe don't understand all of the nuances of every single country.
Yeah. And Amir, from your perspective, the regulations, I know we talked before that perhaps they're interpreted differently in different countries. How do you find trying to grow and decide which countries to expand into? What are the challenges there, and what do you think could be done better?
Yeah, so, Zaver is a Swedish payment institution under the supervision of the Swedish FSA. And so we have been exposed to a bit of, regulatory stuff. And the problem is, we have the Second Payment Services Directive Act, for instance, just as an example, which is harmonized to, the majority of it at least. But we really need more clearer answers on how to look at certain important questions. Like, Sweden cannot have this kind of view when it comes to AML, and Germany another one, because obviously we can passport our licenses, we can operate in different kind of markets with the licenses within the EEA, but we really should, from a governmental perspective, give the answer on what is right and what is wrong. Otherwise, we try to say that the companies and the private market should decide that, and when something goes wrong, we still are not happy with that. So I would really like to have more clearer framework on how we should act in certain questions, because sometimes that's not really clear between the countries.
And Elizabeth, what about you? The challenges between operating in different countries and regulations being applied differently?
Well, honestly, I'm inspired that you're even complaining about it, because I thought that was business as usual. I'm operating in 100 countries, and we have AML drop-down menus that are completely different in all of them, and I just assumed that was normal, but I'm glad to hear that maybe there's hope for that to be harmonized. I think, I lived 7 years in East Africa, where the East African community couldn't harmonize amongst 3 countries. And I did my thesis 20 years ago on the European Union, and we still have issues with the harmonization there. So I think, I'm a pragmatist, and I understand that it's different, and I think that's a barrier to entry for companies that can manage that complexity. I mean, I'd love to see it harmonized, but like I said before, I have a lot of my Nigerian colleagues manage to finally get a UK resident permit, but then they can't visit my Spanish office because they don't have a Schengen visa. So we just kind of assume that this is part of the deal, and we work around it. Obviously, it would be great if it would be harmonized, but I think there's so much left in the payments industry and in the fintech industry in a greater sense to be developed. We're still very young in comparison.
Okay, thank you. And I think it is an ongoing challenge of how to address those, but you have managed to navigate it in many different places so far. I wanted to turn now to listings, which I mentioned, and perhaps we could start with you, Elizabeth. I know that you have considered an IPO before, but have decided not to. And I'm interested in, how exchanges in Europe can attract companies to list with them and then support their growth there. We've seen such high-profile losses already this year, Arm shunning the UK, CRH opting for the US, and Diageo dropping its Dublin and Paris listing. So I'm interested to hear from all of you what you think the disincentives are at the moment, but how can exchanges compete?
Yeah, great question. So 10 years ago, we were part of the first fintech movement in the African continent. And in 10 years, there's been less than a dozen unicorns. And some of those African unicorns, I would argue, maybe aren't even African. Not because of who they are, but where their business operations lie. So I think we don't have the data points to show that it's successful. And the London Stock Exchange had a feeder program for rising African companies. We've been a part of the program for many years, pushing them towards the AIM small cap exchange. We've been working with NASDAQ. We've seen a lot of fintechs around the world list in Amsterdam or Toronto. But we still don't have the data set that shows that it's a pathway a lot of companies can go down. And I think that then cycles back into the lack of investment, not only in the sector, but in the region. And then the double whammy of, fintechs in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think, until we see that data set, it's a chicken and an egg, it's hard to go forward with that listing. And the second thing, which we talked about earlier, is that in a bear market, all the gremlins come out, and we've had so much activist research for a lot of payment companies with, I think, dLocal, there is one with FleetCor, Block and Square have seen that happen all in the last few months. And, that's, again, a hurdle that a lot of companies will have to overcome right after IPO. So I think so many companies think about IPO, but what happens after? It's like I tell new parents, don't worry about the birth and delivery. It's the next 18 years. So, I think we need to get real about how much further in the process we need to go before the cycle really matures.
And Amir, what does the market landscape look like to you as you're expanding in Europe?
Yeah, obviously we're not looking at IPOing right now, but I would say one of the biggest challenges I see that we have in Europe compared to the US, if you have an entrepreneur building a successful tech company such as, let's say, Spotify, it's a shame it's not listed in Stockholm, right? But I really understand the reasons behind it, because you need to have institutional investors who understand tech companies, who understand how you put a price tag on Spotify versus Ericsson or Saab, because it's totally different business models. And if that understanding is really not there at that market, it's going to be problematic. Just to give you an example, Germany is the 4th largest economy in the world after US, China, and Japan, and the largest one in Europe. But the Frankfurt Stock Exchange is too small. It's a fraction of what it should be, because culturally maybe people actually had their money in deposits, deposit accounts, etc. So one of the things is like, I think we should try to educate the market in Europe. Like we today know that maybe we should teach people software engineering at a lower age in the schools. Why are we not teaching people from a early stage how the stock market works? You shouldn't have to go to a business school in order to understand the basics of this and get the retail people with you.
That's a very interesting point, and perhaps a contrast to in the US. David, obviously working across different continents, do you find that that is something that the financial knowledge and awareness and appetite for it is different in the EMEA?
I think it's funny. I might reframe that, because I'm not an expert in as my panelists are in this space. But what I might reframe it: 20 years ago, no one had ever heard of the words Trivago, Amazon, and other companies that we now completely take for granted, who have subsequently gone through the process of IPOing and obviously now sort of stock market behemoths either in the US or here in Europe. And I think if I could just take it to an even slightly earlier stage, even than birth, maybe conception, if I could stretch your analogy, and to say it's absolutely vital that governments, regulators, and where organisations like Google can provide any support, help the next generation of companies emerge. And I think in the US, if you just look at just the physical amount of tech companies that are either born there or have acquired their European equivalents. For example, both Booking and Trivago were acquired by US organizations eventually. I think that's actually something that even before they get to sort of their fully fledged stage, I think we need to provide more support. It can't be the case that it's just easier to birth one of those organizations in the US than it is here. So that's something we feel really passionate about, and supporting small, fast-growing businesses, I think is the mandate of all of us, particularly in the tech industry.
Yeah, and that is something I did want to touch on actually, both from bigger companies, but also from governments. What social, financial policies, or even physical infrastructure, which does still matter, and especially when we're talking about people. What do you think that companies need to start and grow? Perhaps starting with you, David, as we were discussing it.
I think government can provide the kind of fertile seed bed in which organisations can grow. If a government like Ireland, in fact, puts digital at the heart of its economic and social goals, that country will thrive. We see it here in Ireland. Partner at today's conference is the IDA. An incredible partner in really embedding that thinking at the heart of government. And I think that is the single most critical thing. That unlocks talent. That unlocks the innovation, and that sort of maybe gives a sort of aspiration to sort of entrepreneurs in any given country to really grow their business. There's lots of other factors too, but if I was to sort of isolate and define one, I think that's a really, really important one. That seems to be what successful countries like Ireland, Estonia, others have really made the hallmark of their success.
And Elizabeth, what would your perspective be on what governments can do to provide financial, social, or physical infrastructure?
Well, we think about this a lot. We're in 115 markets, but we have 17 physical subsidiaries, or national subsidiaries. So we're constantly shopping for friendly markets. And where do we go to access the region? And in Europe, we ended up we bought a company in Spain for several reasons. Part of the reason is the rule of law there, protecting fintechs with bank accounts. So banks have a tendency sometimes, if they feel like the fintech starts to compete with them, to either raise the fees to 10x or close the account for secretive reasons. And in Spain, you're protected by law from that. So we've found that very helpful. Of course, we went to Luxembourg for our group company, and we actually find it I didn't see any Luxembourg government officials here, so I'll speak, very onerous because of their corporate governance bureaucracy. And something, you don't think about this when you're starting a fintech or a company, but down the line, several fundraising rounds later, if I need to have the signature of every single shareholder's 5 children, parents, and pets, every time I do a corporate governance action, it's incredibly difficult and can hold up a fundraiser, can hold up a corporate action. Similarly with the change of control, when we acquire companies or we start to go into M&A. So I think, these things you don't think about at conception, but are definitely very important later on. And then a theme that we've been discussing many times throughout this conference is the pairing of the government and the banking sector. Mm-hmm. So how do corporates work with the government to support new innovative companies? How do incumbents welcome them? And I think that's the unspoken need. Are the incumbents welcoming? In Estonia, all of the corporates have been arms wide open to welcome new innovative companies because, of course, they're competing with larger countries. So I think, countries that want to attract young talent have to think not only of the first stage of welcoming them with incentives, but later on, how does the corporate governance approach function for a smaller company? And then what do the corporates and the financial sector do to welcome those companies as well?
Amir, as a newer company trying to attract young talent, what's your perspective on what you need to see from governments infrastructure-wise on whichever aspect?
Yeah, so, I believe there is this golden rule of the 3 A's, basically. You have to have access to capital, access to talent, and also access to data if you're building technical solutions. And if you have 2 of these but not access to data, it's going to be hard to build new solutions which are purely software. And I see that in a lot of countries within the Central European space. You have these large economies, you have a lot of talent, but access to data is not that developed as it is in the Nordics, where you have open APIs with the governmental authorities. And that's maybe one of the reasons we have so many payments companies coming from Sweden. I don't know, but that is super important. So I would say try to, in a sane way, help these companies access data points so they can, let's say, increase the conversion rate, not only in the checkout, but also the conversion rate from having companies founded at the seed stage later on becoming, actual businesses. So the data discussion is super important, because if you try to be too restrictive, it's going to hurt in a different way.
Well, thank you so much to all our panelists for your fantastic answers. I hope that we'll learn something about what companies need to see in order to be able to grow in Europe and stay in Europe. And I think talent retention and attraction seems to be one of the key themes that people are struggling with, as well as regulation and working across different jurisdictions. So thank you so much to David, Elizabeth, and Amir.